Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Climate Trends podcast. This is the podcast where we discuss key topics shaping climate change and sustainable development. As climate extremes intensify across the globe, one of the most urgent and under-acknowledged challenges is heat stress, especially in countries like India, where low-income communities are living and working in informal, poorly ventilated spaces. From puffed rice vendors to tailors, livestock farmers to urban informal workers, millions are exposed to life-threatening temperatures every day, not just in homes, but also in the very spaces where they earn their livelihoods. My name is Gunjan. I'm the Assistant Director at Climate Trends. Welcome to all of you. And in this episode, we have a very special guest with us, Nirmita Chandrasekhar, who is a Senior Program Manager with SELCO Foundation. Nirmita, welcome to the Climate Trends podcast. If I might just give a very brief introduction, SELCO is a not-for-profit organization, and that has been working on the front lines of sustainable energy and development for the last 15 years. And Nirmita has been with SELCO for the last 8 of those. Nirmita is a systems thinker and innovation-driven practitioner who leads initiatives and develops programs to tackle poverty, inequity, and climate resilience. Her work centers on identifying and addressing systemic barriers through participatory, human-centered approaches that enable communities to access inclusive climate solutions. With a background in architecture, she has played a key role in shaping narratives and solutions at the intersection of the built environment and climate action. Welcome to the podcast, Nirmita. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you.
I think before I go into any technical questions, I was very curious to understand what has been your own personal journey to kind of look at architecture from a resilience and a sustainable lens, because that's not something which is very mainstream yet.
So when I started my career, I think even actually before that, when we were in college, a lot of our learnings when it came to sort of looking at design, looking at how you sort of build spaces, had a very community and end user centric sort of focus. And as we sort of then transitioned into working in companies, a lot of those sort of practices kind of vanished. You were not necessarily looking at communities at the center. It was the builder or how much sales could you make on the property that you were sort of designing for. And that pivot kind of happened when I met SELCO Foundation and I started working over here. And we began our projects at that point in 2017 in very poor urban settlements in Bangalore itself. Um, a lot of the decisions were suddenly not necessarily external, but very internal. People had very poor access to materials, and even if they wanted to prioritize themselves, it was not the most topmost in their list of priorities. It was about feeding their children, education, the roti kapda makan, and the makan was the last piece within that. And that's when we started also within SELCO Foundation to look at the built environment space and what kind of innovation in technology, in processes, in systems were required for this to change. And obviously, it's now some almost 8 years of journey with the space.
It's lovely. Um, I live in the Delhi NCR region, and I think across NCR we are seeing these massive skyscrapers which are coming up, middle class, and I think a lot of them have these kind of materials which they are investing in. Seeing how Delhi is extremely vulnerable to heat stress. I mean, last year temperatures, I think they crossed 50 degrees, but that's been under debate. But nevertheless, they were extremely high. How do you think these kind of urban infrastructure for companies, businesses that are coming up, how sustainable they are to deal with the heat stress that cities like Delhi are going to be seeing in the immediate and the near future?
So, what we need to sort of first understand is that heat impacts the way we live, the way we work, the productivity that we have, as well as, the quality of life you're able to lead in the long run. And when it comes to specifically increasing temperatures in our cities and in our rural context. And that is something that's maybe less spoken about how rural contexts also have very extreme heat events. um, that sort of compounds multifolds for people in different strata of society. Now, within urban context, you have urban slums, which are designed extremely dense, where there is density not just in the layouts, but also within the households. There are, more than like 10, 15 people living within a 100, 200 square foot footprint home. And most often, these homes are built poorly. So if you say that outdoor temperatures are 35, sometimes indoors more than 40 degrees, right? And the other thing to remember is that as we are concretizing all of our cities and now also rural tier 2, tier 3 cities and rural contexts, concrete and these materials have the capacity to trap heat, which
Mhm.
basically means that it's not just your midday, hot events that you need to be worried about. It's also the fact that night becomes also very difficult for people to recover. The temperatures indoors that some of the contexts that we can record are, 35, 40 degrees also at night. Uh, and I can maybe give you an example. We were sort of working in Ahmedabad with Mahila Housing Trust, and there was this one woman who very simply had told this to us. She began her day at 3 a.m., 4 a.m., where it was usually the time to wake up because, pani aata hai, and there's water available in the community at that point. And till 9, 10 in the morning, she's engaged in household chores, working, preparing food for her family, XYZ. And then you have the few hours between household chores that you are actually also doing work. So she, in this case, was a tailor who was doing work from home. And there was no rest even till like 11 p.m. at night. And she was herself telling us that her quality of sleep had reduced so much, especially during the summer months, that it was impossible to wake up refreshed. And what that happens is that the physiology of your body then is not able to cope with rising temperatures further, so it's very cyclical in that manner. So this is the actual ground realities that we have. And then I want to just sort of also compare this to a tribal context. We were working in Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, sorry, MP, Madhya Pradesh, and Odisha with women who were poultry farmers. And they were raising 500 birds ka flocks, and Jharkhand, you had like context where it was extreme summers and extreme winters, but in Odisha and MP, there were extreme summers that they were facing. And over the years, because these birds have like, a subjective temperature sort of range, core temperature range, they were not able to cope up in the summer months. And mortality was increasing heavily. People were not able to sort of see any returns on their income. And now you have also these women trying to cool their sheds, so that they have a livelihood income at the end of the day. Trying to also sort of, spend your 9 to 5 hours actually just actively pouring water on the sheds, keeping the birds cool, feeding water. And all of this drudgery sort of adds up in the end. And what we were also observing over there was women were reporting that after a certain age, they were not able to do work because it was so physically strenuous. And these are the actual realities when you go on the ground that you see what heat is actually in communities.
No, absolutely. And um, I have kind of reported from the field and seen the kind of living conditions that communities own. I mean, even in urban areas, I think people are staying in these single room spaces where entire families would be cramped and there is not a single window. And that's also the space where they are cooking, which means that the heat and the steam and everything that's coming out, that's getting trapped inside those four walls where those people are. So the thermal kind of comfort is of course out of the way, but temperatures are further rising, like you said. Um, you talked about nighttime temperatures, and that reminds me that I think last year there was a very interesting study which had come out and that looked at nighttime temperatures. I remember coming across that. And I remember some of the scientists at that time were a little unsure if India is the right place to even look at nighttime temperatures. It might be a more first world narrative that, it might feel like, that we're talking about sleep when there are more bigger priorities for people, for developing countries, people in the developing countries. And that we had to say that no, that's not true. I think it's more of a reality here, and it's
That,
more needed in countries like India, where we have such a huge population of migrant workers and people who do not have access to cooling and need those 8 hours of sleep for extremely strenuous physical labor to continue the next day for their livelihood and survival. So definitely, I think uh, India becomes very relevant in that sense, especially with our largest population that we have. Um, but yeah, I think just moving on. What are the kind of livelihoods you see which are going to be affected due to the rising temperatures and the sort of both, like you touched upon, both the working conditions as well as the living conditions. I remember there was a story we had done about a migrant couple who were construction workers in Delhi, and because of the heat, the wife had to they was constantly they were bearing health expenses, and they finally could not deal with construction work, so the wife had to let go of the construction work and move towards household help, became in household help, and the income went down, the health expenses went up. So heat is directly also impacting what we say the India's efforts to pull millions out of poverty. So yeah, if you could speak to this a bit.
so, I mean, outdoor work, I feel like across the board has been majorly affected for sure. You have construction workers, farmers that we are working with, who have been reporting that they start work as early as sometimes 3 a.m., 4 a.m. because they can then, finish their work by sort of 11 a.m. and um, avoid the extreme heat conditions that they have otherwise have to deal with. There's obviously, hence, also effects on the produce and the product that sort of comes out of the farms that are getting affected, not just the well-being of the farmers themselves. Our work is also majorly with, small and micro nano businesses. And what we've been observing over there is additionally like something similar, right? We had this cluster of puff price workers we were engaging with, and just covered in a video series called Work at 45, where they start work so early in the morning. It's like not even middle of the night, and by the 11 a.m. mark, are sort of pouring buckets of water on themselves to keep themselves cool. Like when you're dealing with flame and heavy manufacturing, these kinds of industries are what we are observing is like this heavy disruptions. And what happens in indoor workspaces, as is the construction industry, is that um, you suddenly become prone to more accidents additionally indoor, right? Imagine you have young men and women under the age of 25 who are doing a lot of work indoors in these kinds of spaces where they're like producing utensils or making food. And I want to sort of also highlight that 90% of the food processing that what you sort of see out there is informal also. Um, so investments in the build space doesn't become a priority. Investment in safety doesn't become a priority at all. And we were working in this blacksmith community where they were referring to how alcoholism within the community was increasing because it was the only way to deal with the extreme stress that they were sort of seeing on a day-to-day basis. So these are some of the industries that we interface with, that we're seeing like evidence of, like live evidence of production productivity, household incomes going down. The other thing that we're also observing is the what you were also referring to, how skilled people are becoming unskilled because of this invisible disaster that you're seeing. The construction folks could be like headmasters, carpenters are now sort of moving out of that space because, and doing like maybe cheap labor in cities, in like restaurants and things like that. We're also sort of observing, like I said, farmers, right, because of crop yield and their own well-being, sort of reducing, are again moving into sort of livelihoods and workspaces that are not necessarily where they sort of have core skills and this whole de-skilling is something that I feel like we need to investigate further because that becomes completely, I feel like, unreported also. We've seen a lot of, post cyclone, landslides, floods where people talk about de-skilling and how people sort of fall into this trap of poverty over and over again. But the heat piece is, I feel like, something that has been completely like ignored in this piece.
Um, Among all the extreme weather events that we see, floods, cyclones, or extreme rainfall, heat stress, etc., which do you think is the uh, sort of the biggest risk when it comes to lived environments for India? And what would be sort of your reasoning for that, especially within that framework of build structures?
So when we've been working with communities, I feel like there might always be an additional disaster typology, like whether it's in Meghalaya or Mizoram, Assam, Odisha, Karnataka. Across all of these contexts, you will have a multi-dimensional sort of risk that the communities face from multiple disasters. But the common thread across the board is increasing temperatures and you have like reports from farmers to textile workers, weavers, everyone talking about not just the fact that temperatures are rising in all seasons, but in certain contexts you see uh, the frequency of hot days are also sort of going up. Which means that cities like Bangalore might have had like 1 or 2 hot days per year, and they're like extreme heat events, what I'm referring to. And those are, I mean, you see those in now contexts like Mizoram, which, you are assuming that it's quite pleasant throughout the year. Um, and for us, it's again multidimensional. It's not how people are reporting heat events. We are actually collaborating with states who are drafting their first ever, heat wave policy for public health to respond to, so these are some of the things that in our work dispersed across the board, we are seeing this sort of recurring in various different ways. And that's another thing to sort of call out, which is that heat can is not siloed. That you can't just sort of say that this is a disaster management authority's responsibility. We're seeing a cross sectionality where the panchayats, the public health systems, SRLMs, everyone are sort of really invested in solving for this because it is a big deterrent that communities are themselves sort of responding and sort of talking about. The other thing I did want to call out was the fact that when we were also sort of looking at use cases and reasonings across the globe, what we also learned was that 23 countries minimum have reported at least one day where they sort of hit 50 degrees. And there are a lot of new countries, especially in the global north, that are also sort of reporting that or somewhere close to those numbers. So it's not a reality. I feel like 8 years ago when we were talking about it, maybe people didn't have enough evidence for it. But right now you have World Health Organization, WMO, lots of global institutions talking about how this is important and are pushing out, at least at this point, awareness and evidence because I think only then will you see action and innovation within this space.
Thanks, Nirmita. Absolutely. And I think as we are seeing more and more temperatures rise across India, like you've said, every region is facing it in a different way. And I think adaptability also changes because of that. Those of us living in northern parts are still more accustomed to having a summer which touches or crosses 40 degrees. That's a normal summer. And we, in fact, we require that much temperature for various crops. But people in supposing Bangalore, 40 degrees is unlivable almost because that has never been the sort of the highest temperature. Absolutely. Keeping that in mind, how would you say that? What are the alternatives do you think that there are for assessing what productive work means? Because if livelihoods across the country, across different sectors are getting affected. And of course, we touched upon agriculture. That's one of the biggest kind of labor inducting sector, for, so to say, for India. But there are a whole scale of others. MSMEs is one of the largest kind of, India has one of the largest MSME sector. And that again is small factories and setups which are not fully equipped to deal with this. So, how do we kind of assess what is productive work in an era of climate extremes? How do you think sectors can respond to this to kind of ensure that when we are talking about productivity, it's directly also an economic impact. And like we've said, livelihoods are getting affected, but overall sectoral implications will also start coming in, are coming in. So, how would you kind of explain that?
So, so actually, when you go back to metrics, right, on how people were gauging what the impact of heat stress was on, it was mostly for like tea gardens and textile workers within sort of warehouses and factories, where it was very simply sort of gauge how many sick days are people taking in a month, and how much is that reducing with improved spaces, improved built environments. But what we also realized when we started this journey was that people also reported as the number of hours that they're able to productively engage with work in a day. That became a very big sort of factor for us to influence and sort of speak with stakeholders within this space to talk about why should certain investments be coming into this. The other thing to also remember though is, like I said initially, um, communities that are poor will not prioritize built environment and thermal comfort, because somewhere there is this understanding that money needs to be made for XYZ and comfort is not necessarily a priority, which is where we try to put the onus of improving comfort and sort of improving conditions for better built environments to be designed and built with stakeholders like government, financiers, and institutions at large, because there is where you can see incentives be designed for access to cooling becoming a lot more affordable for people who are dealing with cash flows, on a daily or a weekly basis. Um, and you can also see sort of large investments coming in from states to improve the conditions at the workspaces and at public health institutions and educational facilities, anganwadis, which are also spaces that you would see, the general population using in a full sort of day. When it comes to livelihoods, like I was mentioning, one of the ways that we have been able to actually make impact is by convergence. So imagine, that you are you're baking snacks at home, you're packaging with them, with your self-help groups, and you're set up an enterprise and you're able to make some sales in your immediate local market. What happens is that there are schemes like Pradhan Mantri's, PMFMD, which is for food processing industries focused, where subsidies up to 50% are you're able to avail for capital investment, which means that when I'm setting up my workspace for sort of snack making, I can avail this 50% capital subsidy, which is a big amount, to sort of de-risk and sort of build a better workspace. I would have maybe made a decision to set it up with like tin sheds or asbestos, and instead I'm able to then put in at least a window in that space, put in a chimney to exhaust the heat, or use that money to invest in a better julha, a cook stove that is not heat generating, but is able to sort of efficiently use fuel and contain. So this was one of the sort of ways that where we're seeing that um, you're sort of able to leverage what is already there, existing systems and instruments that are already there in the ecosystem to sort of implement. The other place that we were able to do a lot of impact was also like in Meghalaya, where along with the state government, with the support of the CM and the IS officers who are sort of leading and promoting entrepreneurship locally, We were able to also design zero interest loans that were completely like almost like 70% subsidized by the state, the capital cost, which then becomes like a very sort of easy way for people to adopt, um, you know, in an incentive based way to sort of adopt better built environments that are able to keep your sort of, workspace cooler. You're able to then sort of work for longer hours. And these were some examples where we said that, you don't have to do another cooling action plan or another, separate instrument for incentivizing people or building evidence, but use what is already there within the state to be able to create spaces for people to make better decisions and invest in themselves. So that was something that was very, I think, integral when it came to saying who owns and who sort of responds to this cost of cooling that people are not able to bear themselves.
You talked about cooling action plans, and there a lot of cities have these heat action plans. Uh, how are these two integrated with each other? Is there an integration, and what should be there, and what do you think is right now missing to bring the two together?
So, a lot of the heat action plans, when they're drafted, are in convergence with stakeholders, and there's a big civil society sort of movement where people are able to bring the end users to designing such kinds of action plans. Where I feel like a lot of these action plans fail is in operation. How do you then take something that is a document and actually have them put into action by your district level, your block level, your ward level, government representative? And those become very important when it comes to sort of institutionalizing pooling solutions. I feel like there is a big a lot of awareness can be built via this kind of sort of action plan, but how do you sort of bring solutions to the ground is becoming, I think, the next big step for a lot of them. Because you will see cooling solutions and maybe annexures of such documents, but for general population to be able to, adopt and for communities who are further marginalized then to sort of access these solutions. Somewhere these action plans need to also sort of talk about market supply, strengthening innovation, pushing out more incentives for innovations within these spaces to be, for putting solutions to be developed for the prioritization of bringing in new kinds of innovation like in roofing tech, in active cooling, making things affordable, bringing in investments for financing to actually provide it to communities at very sort of low patient, like interest rates and like long tenure. And those I feel like are very important to sort of build almost like how to guides for, which then sort of helps a practitioner like me or a block level official to then take it to action. So that is something that I feel like is the current challenge and gap within this. And the other thing is also right, like if what I was referring to, that if I am sort of sitting in the SRLM, the livelihood mission within a state, how does a pooling action plan actually converge with my program and annual budgets and plan what I want to sort of put into action? So that kind of sort of cross sector learnings is something that we also sort of try to build, where we say that within departments, within what do you call it, whether it's the panchayati raj or the SRL, we're able to then sort of help them sort of build programs that are keeping heat and heat stress is almost like a default, that it's not a separate program, not a separate thought process, but it's integrated within the sort of action plan within departments. So I feel like that's the role that sort of folks like I have to play within the system. And but that being said, all of them are needed. You need a heat action plan. You need the state to prioritize and the national sort of government to prioritize these pieces. But I feel like the challenges lie in operations and in cross integration.
On that, actually, I know that a couple of cities have been talking about appointing a heat officer, but who is actually responsible for implementing these heat action plans? is there one person or one body which is taking them forward, or who do you hold accountable for the weakness, or who do you strengthen or build capacity for of?
So again, for me, I feel like while these could be like, it's like a token. Even within the health sector, you have a national climate change and heat action for human health, right? Sort of like a program. But if the NHM or the Director for Health Services don't take onus on it, it doesn't matter if this program exists or this fund exists within the state. It needs to be integrated. So for me, I feel like the role of such agents, whether they're for climate change or for heat action, uh, need to be to push for cross integration and sort of capacity building for operations. And maybe I'll sort of leave it at that.
Um, okay. Thanks, Nirmita, for explaining that. Maybe I could now ask you a little about innovation in building design materials, and uh, what are the sort of the core principles of heat resilient design for homes and workspaces? If there are some examples also you'd like to share, I think that would be useful to understand.
Sure. So when it comes to solutioning for heat, there are sort of three things to maybe remember. One is that um, there is an investment that goes into actually the built space itself. Then there is once you have a home or a workspace built, you need to operationally like, run that space itself, right? So there's a lot of OPEX cost that goes into these things. And then you need to think about the investment that needs to go into for repairs and fittings and servicing and things like that, which go maybe out of the sort of, your OPEX could be like your electricity bills, but your repairs and things like that could be to actually sort of repair an air conditioning, which is a one-time investment. So when you sort of think about how this specifically, a lot of the built environment is actually in your capital investment because um, one of the statistics that we find is true in a context like India and most South Asian countries is that a lot of economically weaker section and lower income groups build themselves. By which I mean that I'm either building myself, I'm a mastri, or I have a background in construction, or I will employ a local mastri or a contractor to build my home. Now, what that means is that either I myself or the Mestri needs to be skilled to understand how do you build a home or a workspace to be thermally comfortable. So there is a lot that can be done from just a simple designing. And when we are working with the housing board and housing department in Karnataka, for example, a simple thing we say is that living room should have two windows, window ventilator, and minimum height should be 8 to 10 feet so you're able to mitigate basic amount of heat, right? So there are simple principles and practices that you can employ to design better from the get-go. The orientation of your house, but obviously in certain contexts with density you're not able to necessarily make too many changes over there, but in like rural tribal context you have the opportunity to decide on how you want to orient your home to maximize on ventilation, airflow, wind flow, and sort of shading itself can be designed in a manner much better manner. So that's the building design, and a big component of the opex can be reduced if you're able to put in capital investment and build a better workspace, hospital, whatever it is at the get-go itself. The second, again, what we've observed is that people in India, especially when it's their own home or workspace, improve incrementally, right? So that's another piece that when we see people deciding how to cool their home, हर दिवाली के लिए there'll be one DC cooler, like a cooler in their home. Or you're sort of seeing, people every post monsoons are painting their roofs white so that it becomes sort of cooler for the next summer. So you start seeing like sort of these kinds of trends where people are able to incrementally invest and improve. But like when there is like a wedding or a very sort of important event, people also invest and sort of build better homes. OPEX is like I was mentioning, for the cooler, for the air conditioning that you might fit into your home, you need constant energy supply, which is heavily disrupted in most of the contexts that you would see in. So there is a component where you need to then sort of also look at, maybe at the get-go, investing also in a renewable or a decentralized source of energy, especially for remote contexts. But the electricity bills that we see for the cost of cooling, the OPEX also becomes very important to sort of look at that. And again, if you're able to, like your cooler, like I said, every Diwali, it's because these solutions are not necessarily built to for durability. They're built for sort of that immediate. You see high performance in the beginning, but that performance sort of deteriorates as it years go by. And what we've also seen that innovations in this space is sort of very critical, but I'll come to that maybe later. And the cost of repairs, right? Like if you now put a cool roof solution, very emerging in the, in your region, to repair that roof, where will you find someone who's skilled, or whether it's a carpenter or a maestri who can come and actually do that repair? And the cost of repair also can be really like, burdensome for like communities especially marginalized communities. And so emerging technologies are difficult. For traditional technologies that really work well, right? You're using your mud, wood, and sustainable materials. Also, there is very dearth of skill out there, and that is also something that we've seen that like repairs and maintenance becomes very difficult for communities as an end user, like individual to manage and maintain. So for us, when it comes to sort of innovation, we sort of innovate heavily on design and develop like a package of practice, which we then skill with your mason, contractor, and end user. And when it comes to public buildings like your schools and your health facilities, there's also a component of training government engineers, your block level, village level, state level engineers on what do you mean by a better built environment itself. That becomes very critical from a practice perspective. The other thing that we've tried to sort of do a lot of work on is in understanding supply chain of materials. Now, if your local market only has tin sheets and asbestos, how do you do a better home, right? So for us, that has become a very important sort of piece in trying to solve this puzzle. I feel like with awareness growing up and with distributors being able to sort of, but the manufacturers able to sort of increase their production and distribute to the last mile, it tends to become sometimes very difficult for how do you sort of get lightweight, materials to reach last mile, and that becomes another piece. But we are seeing things like bubble wraps. There is an organization based out of Rajasthan that is using sheep wool to bake insulation material that can then be also wrapped up and like sort of packaged and sent out very easily in your tempo tractors for communities to be able to install, and again does not have any sort of side effects on health, right? So these are some of the innovations that we are seeing, and like sort of how you sort of bring materials to the last mile for people to be able to adopt them. There is a lot of work that's happening in both passive and active solutions. Another organization that we've been in touch with is developing, desiccants that can fit into AC system. What it basically means is your traditional air conditioner to reach a cooling level. Say now you want it to get to 24 degrees, has to also extract humidity from the air, right? And to achieve that, they need to cool to say maybe 20 degrees to achieve your 24 degrees ka uniform temperature indoors. Now, what that means is your energy to cool the air becomes a lot more. So, these desiccant technologies and solutions are able to dehumidify the air and prevent energy consumption when it comes to this kind of a case. We had actually deployed in again Rajasthan, where there was like a weaving center for a community of weavers, air conditioning system. But in context like Rajasthan, where water and energy can be a challenge, traditional air conditioners do not solve for it anymore. So for us, that also becomes a very sort of important sector where we're seeing a lot of innovation coming in from active and passive built materials and sort of products that you can install in your and coming to the last piece, which is actually looking at repairs and services in the last mile, uh, I feel like there is a lot that can be done within that space, and that is something that is, um, uh, how do you sort of create awareness among end users and build skills, and then so we've been sort of able to talk to a few players, but it's not yet institutionalized, and I think that's one of the weakest sections that I've been at least observing in the sector where once you install, what happens then, right? And especially with marginalized groups, it becomes a very important sector to innovate within. So, yeah, that's like a sort of full. Um, what I see is like innovation with the lens on the cost of cooling map.
You talked about the passive and active solutions. Maybe you could just explain a little what those
Sure.
exactly mean.
Sure. So maybe I'll use some examples for these. We were working in, again, I'll use the poultry women's example. So in Odisha, along with the partner, which is NSPDT, they're NGO that works with poultry farmers, that's a federations. What we noticed was that in the few centers with these women that, like I was mentioning, there around 500 birds, we were able to sort of test out solutions where we introduced coolers to sort of space cool that was solar powered. Then we sort of also raised some of those, poultry sheds and integrated insulated roofing into the sort of context, and also raised the canopy of the sheds a little bit to also shade further. And we were able to see mortality rates drop immediately. Like, the birds were able to thrive in those contexts very immediately. And for us, when the solution with, just raising the roof and putting in insulation is a passive solution where you're not using any active source of energy to cool the space. It's only done through some basic sort of building modifications and renovations. Now, when it came to the DC cooler solution, where we actually put in like a cooling solution, it required an energy source to cool the building, so to say. And that became, where your OPEX costs are actually much more higher than your first solution. Maybe the capital cost in the passive is a lot more, but, your monthly and your yearly bills would remain lower in that context. So this is how sort of passive and active solutions are differentiated on the ground here.
Thanks for explaining that, Nirmita. Um, One of the biggest sort of kind of guzzlers of energy and generation and heat generation are urban centers. The entire idea of the entire concept of the urban heat island effect, etc., comes from there. What are the sort of building materials you would say are completely unadvisable in today's context of climate change and rising temperatures, while any kind of development and construction that's happening, and not just within communities, but also for businesses, for residential, larger residential areas, etc., that are coming up in urban centers?
I think what's to maybe first remember is that it's not what material, but how do you build? Because I feel like in a lot of the urban and metro cities that we live and work in, um, you may make a decision to build something out of concrete. But what we see is that the life cycle of the building is not necessarily as long as it used to be before. So the quality of the build, and if you're able to do it as a one-time, offering, so to say, then you're able to sort of create a carbon sink through other means. Now, what is happening though is that it's not just that cities are completely like concretized, but there is no sort of green spaces or carbon sinks that, like, as we call them, created. Cities like Singapore are really good at, um, building with concrete, but also creating enough carbon sinks to mitigate the rising temperatures that they're observing. So you're able to sort of meet durability, build smartly with a very sort of climate smart sort of focus, and improve the quality of your spaces. Cities like Bangalore, for example, had your lakes and your gardens as carbon sinks. What's happening though is that we are building on top of them, which has become the major issue. I feel like the only no-no that we have is the use of maybe asbestos in construction, which in a lot of third world countries you still see asbestos being pushed into and utilized in the construction of habitats, which is a big no-no because of the cancer-causing reasons and the heat trapping, properties of the material. So that is one thing that I would suggest would is something that we should completely avoid. The other, I think, good practice is also that I feel like we nobody can do away with air conditioners anymore. It's almost important for a lot of the communities to be able to people to be able to sort of have productive works in air conditioned spaces. But I think good best practices would be just ensuring that your homes are retrofitted in a manner that you're not guzzling more energy than is required. And air conditioners are sort of capped between your 24 to 26 degrees so that you're able to you sort of be comfortable, but you're also able to not because what happens with air conditioners is they also emit a lot of greenhouse gases, right? So which further heats up spaces. So that's one way to sort of also sort of ensure that you're using it only for the critical hours during the day and you're not sort of shooting beyond your 26 degrees for thermal comfort, which is largely, I think, within the range of everyone's adaptability possible to meet.
You talked about air conditioners, and of course, that also kind of brings to the point which you earlier also touched upon the the cost of living. Air conditioners is also not something which everybody can avoid can afford. And we recently did a public perception kind of an analysis, and it was very clear that a big chunk of people are talking about heat not just as a risk, but also as an economic burden. With the increasing need for cooling, with the increasing electricity bills, the need for these kind of expensive machinery to be bought, maintenance, etc. Um, in countries in the global south where these kind of temperatures are also more rampant, and where there is a huge population which is disenfranchised and does not have access to this kind of cooling, how do we kind of bring together these disparities and kind of try to bridge this cooling divide, so to say?
So, I mean, this is a very apt question, and I feel like something that people are actively trying to solve for. Um, Access to uh, robust technologies, is first of all very difficult because even if you do invest in something, do you know that will last you multiple summers? That becomes something that is important to sort of first understand here. And then it's affordable financing to, invest in these high assets. There is a lot of work that's happening around like personal cooling, which is, you might have seen these gadgets where you have like fans that you can wear, cooling vests and cooling jackets, very sort of advertised as low cost, but quick to wear and tear and not necessarily more sustainable. So the cheap solutions are not durable, and the ones that are durable are very high investments. When it comes to sort of financing for these, I know that there are organizations that are sort of looking at insurances, loan packages for you know simply doing cool roofing, which will mitigate your immediate temperature. So, uh, but again, in the long run, is not necessarily going to get you to your productive so-called levels. So that becomes like a big issue. But for me, I think going back to the whole convergence piece, right? There is a lot of money that exists within our um, uh, governance systems in the form of schemes and subsidies. I feel like it's all about basically understanding where does the money lie and very sort of smartly leveraging it for our purposes. But that being said, it's not sort of, the divide is still quite high. I know that organizations like ours bring in a lot of philanthropic money to subsidize those capital investments. But there is a lot of interest now from finance institutions to bring in investments and sort of provide loans for improving your housing and workspaces. And if you're able to sort of package a very inclusive loan product with a subsidy, then you're able to actually invest better in your, whether it's setting up your home for the first time or in renovating those spaces. I know that in UK there was this whole movement called cold at home or cool at home, where uh, loan products were specifically just designed for adding retrofitting insulation into your homes. There, obviously, the problem was heat during colder months, but something similar in an Indian context, I think, would be really important. And there's a big movement, I feel like, where that needs to happen on just making bankers aware about this problem statement and having banking institutions, nationalized and credit cooperatives, to provide loans specifically for these kinds of solutions. Because the cost of the products, the way it is right now, and the cost of energy is not affordable based on the current cash flows that we see people taking home. I think I've sort of already referred to the example, but there is a lot of 15 Finance Commission, there is the Gram Panchayat sort of, funds that are available that could also be leveraged for improving and investing back into workspaces. Housing, though, tends to become, a big sort of dirt, I feel like. Um, but also keeping in mind that communities and vulnerable communities. So your children, your elderly population, um, pregnant women, things like that, where they're also sort of occupying other spaces. Those need to be sort of catered to for sure. Where we've seen like a lot of investment going into building better hospitals to sort of look at thermal comfort conditions. We are working with Anganwadi, improving Anganwadi conditions and like both from a built environment and installing sort of solar panels on top of them to be able to absorb these OPEXs that they would sort of face. There is also a lot of innovation, I feel like, that needs to happen. While, like I said, the individual level financing tends to be like the biggest gap that we're observing, at an institutional level, the state of Meghalaya with us have co-designed 300 public health facilities and are designed to basically face the brunt of extreme summers, winters, and your rainfall conditions. And this kind of institutional investment is very critical to make cooling accessible. Organizations that we know in Dhaka and in India are developing, intermediary cool spaces, which is basically your bus stops and, any space that people out in the open are sort of using, also needs to be invested in from the states, from national governments, to be able to again be made cooler. So so the onus is not that, just me in my house at my personal capacity, what I'm able to do, but as a collective, how we're able to ensure that, spaces are cool for people throughout the day and throughout any kind of engagement that they're involved in. Yeah.
What are the scalable solutions that you are seeing towards cooling, and which you think are also attracting finance from maybe FIIs or private financiers or just other kind of stakeholders in the space?
Honestly, we've seen scale happen in the cooling space through largely either public money, so from governments, or from philanthropic arms and CSRs. There is very little happening in the financial sort of space, uh, at least not focusedly under the cooling umbrella. So that is one thing that I did want to sort of highlight here. And scale, the kinds of solutions that are also scaling on the ground are largely your low cost but low durable ones. Now, like your cool roofing paints, which are maybe like 12 to 15,000 for a 300 square foot home. Uh, and it's a recurring investment that you will have to do after one or two rains because it's sort of it's not durable and long lasting. So this is the state of the matter that we've seen right now. we've seen the only other sort of large number, which was like I was referring to the poultry, where you had federations bring in money raised from grants and funds like there are state instruments, and more than 500 sheds were built um, for birds. But again, investment in sort of space cooling for livelihoods is where we've seen some great movement, and the other one where the state itself in the health space we saw like big 300 health facilities being built with like keeping in mind thermal comfort as the core focus, and very participatory approach of building better as like some really good movements within India, I feel. Um, but I feel like we're just really beginning in this space. And there is a lot that should be done. And I think the answer to it is convergence. We're able to, but which is also why I think it wouldn't be counted or reported. Because people will not necessarily traditionally say that I'm putting in money for cooling, but you're putting in money for building better workspaces, which also counts. And I think that is something that like the where I feel like a lot of organizations are now sort of taking a lot of good steps in.
As you're saying that a lot of solutions are now, or solutions are being developed now, and temperatures are already beyond levels of comfort.
Mhm.
Um, the IPCC, the UN's IPCC report had said that there is a certain threshold after which adaptation is not possible. Do you think we are looking at adaptation of our built environments to keep pace with changing temperatures, or is there going to be a threshold where these measures will not kind of give us the result that we are looking at? I know it's a bit of a broad, esoteric question, and we can possibly only introspect a little, but yeah, that would be nice to hear what you think.
I feel like both passive and active solutions have limitations. A lot of cooling and solar solutions in extreme cold and extreme heat, they have performances that reduce, their efficiency reduces. So that is something that I feel like, if you're in this sort of, if you're not able to look at referring to again what Singapore did, really like put a stop to growing temperatures within cities and within sort of tier two rural contexts, and build in a lot of carbon sinks through your lakes and your green gardens and like sort of parks, and sort of foster your forests and things like that. I mean, that is the ultimate adaptation that is required for us to see any positive change. But technologies are limited. In the, in you're referring to your sort of central belt also in what we're seeing on the ground, like when temperatures reach 40, 50 degrees, like what do you do? Right? There is like air conditioners also can't perform 24 by 7 at the same level of performance. You start seeing damage and like, wear and tear occur very quickly in such extreme heat geographies. You can really put in a lot of money into your built environment and passively design it to sort of deter heat, but you will end up with sort of, very nocturnal activities happening in such regions because daytime and sort of midday, especially, is going to be impossible to be able to do any kind of productive activity in whether it's work or school or something like that. So I feel like the trend is quite bleak where we are sort of walking towards. And unfortunate is that both active, especially with active cooling, there is one thing where they further emissions and further increase temperatures in any context, and very sort of critical factor in urban heat island effect. But on the other side, if you and I are also exposed to prolonged exposure to cooling spaces, artificially cooled spaces, also changes our physiology, right? So as years pass, you will not be able to yourself regulate your body temperatures, your core temperatures. And that is something that is going to be again very cyclical, where you're going to be heavily dependent on air conditioners, but you're not able to sort of uh, manage your own core temperatures at all. So this is a very sort of a bleak answer to maybe a question like that, but it is where we're going. And I think I just also wanted to answer your scaling solution because something came to my mind. In 2015, um, Attenborough fans introduced the BLDC sort of motor in the fan industry, right? And we usually negate fans as a cooling application, but it's a very critical and traditional sort of cooling application in tropical context. And what they did with their BLDC fans was that uh, at that point, fans were ranging from your 70 to 90 watts, and they were able to bring down the wattage down to 50 to 30 watts. And what that did was made it much more affordable to have fans within spaces. And obviously, with the BLDC motor, they were suddenly seeing innovations in designs, and you were able to sort of use sensor-based models and remote control-based models to also control the consumption, because a lot of our cooling is also behavioral. If you don't switch off your AC, it will stay on the whole day. It will consume energy, right? So it made sort of behavior to switch on, switch off a lot more easy with the sensor and the remote control base. And I feel like what's so great about the BLDC fan sort of revolution that had happened at that point was that in less than 10 years, every major fan manufacturer had moved to PLDC. And I think that's something what we need to see in your air conditioning and your passive cooling space also. You need one major innovation to disrupt the industry to be able to then make things a lot more affordable. And whether that's in cool roofing paints or whether that's in making air conditioners more efficient, or make, cool roofing materials more, lot more, easy to use and easy to build with, and integrate insulation in existing homes. So those, I think, system disruptors are what we really are looking for at this stage. That can massively sort of change trends on how both consumers and sort of demand driven sort of approach is what's required.
So those are very useful examples, Nirmita. Um, Geographically, which are the states where you feel there is more steps being taken towards managing heat? I know Gujarat and Ahmedabad, of course, are India's golden example, and they have kind of led and continue to lead the way on that. But
Correct.
other than that, like which are the states which are at least recognizing and starting to respond? I feel Delhi still is, despite the kind of temperatures we experience and the kind of political and media focus the national capital has, it still is very far away from actually addressing the problem despite having a heat action plan. So, which states or regions you feel are maybe moving faster than others?
I feel like Hyderabad already has a heat action plan a few years ago that they released, quite comprehensively designed. There is Jodhpur and Jaipur, I think, also in Rajasthan, that have sort of at least have drafts out. I'm not sure whether they've released. I know that cities like Bangalore in the south are also sort of taking tremendous steps in this direction. What I also see layered on top of that is a lot of philanthropic action also then doubling down on those investments. So we're seeing a lot of money and like sort of efforts and collectivization that's happening around solving for cooling as a result of those action plans being developed in those specific
Mm.
cities. Um, but but I feel like there is a what we don't notice is within the health space. There are a lot of states that are taking action. Like I was mentioning, I was very shocked to when I was interacting with this district level medical officer in Manipur, where she was referring to the fact that even in the context of the state, they are at the district level itself mobilizing and sort of creating facilitating ASHA workers and nurses to be able to be the front line of ensuring that there is enough awareness around heat stress and enough sort of mitigation and health care provisions available at the district level itself. So there are these like sort of micro champions that you're seeing emerging
Mm.
across, and that I think has also been very sort of nice to see. Uh, People are making themselves aware and then are then taking action in their own sort of local context.
Right. Talking about ASHA workers, and you touched upon this earlier, and I wanted to come back to it then. But how is heat how is heat affecting women in specific? Because a huge section of agricultural workers, labor is women, and they are more vulnerable. They are facing both at home and at the work environment. So and also a lot of the indigenous solutions, at least in the agriculture sector, a little that I've read about and know, there are indigenous solutions which are coming up, and women also are behind those indigenous solutions because our countries are they we have traditionally experienced high temperatures. We are not people who lived in 20 degrees and are suddenly experiencing 40-degree. So we have grown up, our generations have grown up in being accustomed to higher temperatures in large parts of the country. So there are traditional methods which people are resorting to. How much role do you think? So this is a bit of a two-part question. One is, of course, how they are impacted, and two is what sort of role they are playing in bringing about more indigenous solutions towards cooling and managing heat.
I think the role of women ASHA workers and community leaders in general has largely been the at sort of the forefront of ensuring that communities are aware that they're resonating with these lived experiences and this um, the scientific evidence that we have are easily translatable by ASHA workers to communities on how does this affect your day to day. I think that's the biggest sort of impact that I've seen on how they're able to bring about adoption of solutioning. It's not just the what do you call it? Just the fact that they themselves are able to imbibe this and sort of take it forward. The other thing that I've also noticed is in Ahmedabad and like with organizations like Mahila Housing Trust, which I've referred to a few times already, is that they've been able to. What they say is that women are definitely the first adopters within communities. They will be the first mobilizers within the communities. But what is important is that it is not going to happen overnight. You will see, you need to put in very long term and very patient sort of methods of working with these women, helping them understand their own sort of lived realities, correlate the different pieces of their life, and suddenly you're able to see like changes happen. And what MHD type organizations have been able to do is then sort of see women investing in cooling, see making savings, to invest in cool roof solutions and solar solutions, fans and energy efficient technologies. And that has been, I think, a very good example that we have observed of how they're making change on the ground. And again, referring to what the CMHO was telling me coming along in Manipur, is that they're able to train the ASHA workers and the ANMs and the medical officers, and who are predominantly women again, on sort of how to sort of manage heat, preparing of like heat rooms, and and sort of what do you call cooling stations, so to say, at the health facility level, which is at the village center, right? And how do you then sort of ensure that people are actively using it? And they're seeing a lot of like adoption and like increased sort of footfall during summer months for people coming to actually mitigate their heat sort of related issues that they're sort of facing, and whether that's fevers or it's sort of coming out as headaches and any kind of sort of side effects. So that has been at least my experience in understanding sort of related to adoption. And that's true for, I feel like, in other contexts also. If you're able to sort of resonate and provide evidence, then you start seeing people prioritize and invest.
India has made some ambitious climate targets at the UNFCCC, and which are focused hugely on mitigation, but there is the entire focus on creating carbon sinks as well. But there is, from what we understand, there is a national adaptation plan also, which India is drafting and which is in process. If you look at other kind of global south countries which are experiencing these kind of temperatures, um, how prepared or ill prepared to deal with this problem you think India is?
So, over the past 2 years, I have been part of two global coalitions working on looking at what is the evidence around heat and how does it affect end users communities, and then B, what are the solutions out there. And I think what's really heartening in those spaces for me is that most of the solutions that get mapped tend to be emerging from the Indian subcontinent and specifically India. And I feel like for me, what's heartening is that there is a lot of innovation that's happening because we are so close to the problem statement within the country. And and then what you're seeing in other countries right now is this whole denial of climate change, denial of the fact that it needs to be intersectional. And that is not the status quo in a lot of the conversations we're having at multiple governance levels, whether it's at district, state, or national. If anything, there is almost like a promotion of the whole sort of entrepreneurship and startup piece and investments that are coming into our country to sort of mitigate for this. And also, the organizations that we deal with on a day to day basis are very multidimensional. There is no sort of looking at things in silo. People are solving for it, understanding that it's livelihoods and cooling, it's healthcare and cooling, it's education and cooling. And so, what is also very important is that we're able to sort of look at a multi sectoral approach where stakeholders are able to sit on the table and actually discuss how do you solve for it. And what's more important is we are seeing states investing in cooling in different ways, in the many examples that I gave. So for me, while all of these are very like sort of important points and we're going the right direction, um, none of us are able to, still sort of understand the actual realities of uh, what increasing heat and climate is going to do. But at least what is important is that there is a lot of solutions that are coming out from our ground. So yeah, that's the note that.
Thanks, Nirmita. That is a good note to end on. That while there is a massive problem staring at all of us, I think what's important is that there are solutions being worked upon, and I think India is. It's good to hear that India is definitely at the forefront of those solutions because we are, like you said very rightly, that we are dealing with the problem statement. So it's a lived reality. Um, with that, I think we can conclude this episode. Thank you so much, Nirmita, and thank you to all our listeners and audience who is watching this episode. This brings us to the end of our chat today, and what a conversation it's been. If there's one thing that we are taking away is that dealing with extreme heat isn't just about finding ways to cool down. It's about fairness, dignity, and making sure no one is left behind, especially those who live and work in the toughest of conditions. Nimita, thank you so much for joining us and sharing the incredible work that Selco is doing on the ground. Your stories and insights really show us what's possible when we design solutions with communities and not just for them. And I think that's the critical nuance and difference which we need to understand and address equity in the country. And to everyone for listening, thanks for being with us. We'll be back soon with more conversations from the front lines of climate change. Until then, stay curious, stay cool, and remember, real climate action starts where it matters most. Thank you.